been nearly 30 years, but I still remember the cold that winter. Not just the kind that creeps through the walls of an old house, but the kind that settles deep in your chest, the type you can't shake no matter how close you sit to the fire. It was December 1997, and I was house-sitting for a family friend in upstate New York. They had gone out of state for the holidays, and since I was a college student with no plans that year, I jumped at the chance for a quiet getaway. The house sat on the edge of a sprawling forest, the kind of place where you could step outside and not see another soul for miles. It was beautiful in the daytime, with sunlight filtering through frost-covered trees, but at night, when the wind howled and the shadows stretched across the snow, it felt different. The farmhouse itself was old, built in the late 1800s. It had its charms: cracky floorboards, a wood-burning stove, and antique furniture that seemed frozen in time. But it also had quirks. The power flickered when the wind picked up, and the nearest phone line was a 15-minute drive away. Cell service? Non-existent. I wasn't afraid at first. I've always enjoyed solitude. The thought of spending a few days alone, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence, sounded peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, drank tea, and watched the snow fall through the large living room window. It was quiet, tranquil even. And looking back, I remember how unnaturally still everything felt that night. Like the house, the woods, and even the air itself were holding their breath. At the time I brushed it off. It was just the unfamiliarity of the place, or so I thought. By the second night, the isolation began to settle in. The house seemed bigger, emptier. Every creak of the old wood felt louder. The wind outside seemed sharper. And, as I would soon find out, I wasn't as alone as I had thought. The second night started much like the fire, trying to enjoy the stillness, though the silence felt heavier now. Around midnight, as I was dozing off on the couch, a knock at the back door jolted me awake. It wasn't loud, more like a tap, a single, deliberate sound. I froze, heart racing, and stared at the door. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? After a moment, I convinced myself it must have been the wind rattling something loose. Still, I got up to check. The door was locked, just as I'd left it. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob. Finally, I unlocked it and opened the door a crack. Cold air rushed in, stinging my face, but there was no one there. What struck me immediately, though, were the footprints. Fresh tracks, crisp and unmistakable, led up to the back door from the woods. I leaned out, scanning the darkness, but the tracks stopped at the door. There were none leading back. I told myself it had to be an animal, though deep down I knew better. I shut the door quickly and bolted it. My pulse was still pounding, but I tried to shake it off. It was late, and I was letting my imagination run wild. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on new stories. The next incident came the following evening. I was sitting in the kitchen, flipping through an old magazine, when I heard soft, deliberate shuffling on the front porch. It sounded like someone pacing, their weight crunching the icy snow. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the window that faced the porch. I expected to see an animal, maybe even a stray dog. Instead, I saw a faint smudge on the frosted glass. It was high up, too high for any animal. I stepped closer, squinting at it, and felt the air leave my lungs. It was a handprint. The shape was unmistakable. 5 fingers pressed into the frost, long and thin. But what struck me was the size. It was larger than any hand I'd ever seen, almost distorted, like it didn't belong to a person at all. The third night began uneventfully, but by now the unease had settled in deep. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed alive, and every creak of the house felt deliberate. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. One moment, the lights were flickering softly, and the next, I was plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the fire in the living room, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I went to check the breaker in the basement. The air down there was freezing, far colder than the rest of the house, but everything appeared normal. I flipped the switches a few times to no avail. As I turned to head back upstairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. Faintly, just beyond the walls, I heard whispers. At first I thought it might be the wind, but the cadence was too deliberate. It sounded like a conversation, low, hushed, voices coming from the woods. I climbed the stairs slowly, listening. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. They weren't angry or urgent, just constant. As if 2 people were standing just beyond the tree line, murmuring to each other. I peered out the back window, which overlooked the woods. The snow was untouched, the trees still, yet the voices persisted. And then they began to get closer. My chest tightened as I backed away from the window. The whispers grew louder and clearer, though I still couldn't understand them. They surrounded the house, moving fluidly from one side to the other. I grabbed the fire poker and stood frozen in the middle of the living room, gripping it tightly. For hours, the whispers continued, sometimes faint, sometimes near. I didn't see a single figure, but I could feel them, whoever or whatever it was. When dawn finally broke, the voices faded with the rising sun, leaving me shaken but unharmed. By the 4th night, I'd stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. I had double-checked every lock, covered the windows with blankets, and kept the fire roaring all day, hoping the warmth would make me feel safer. That evening, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't a single timid tap. It was loud and frantic, like someone was pounding on the back door with both fists. I froze in place, the sound reverberating through the house. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the kitchen. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to stay back. But I had to see. The pounding stopped just as I reached the door. Slowly, I turned the flashlight on and aimed it through the window. The beam illuminated the porch, but it was empty. I scanned the area, the light bouncing off the snow, and that's when I noticed the lock. The metal was twisted and scratched, as if someone had tried to force it open. But what made my stomach drop was the knife. It was small, rusty, and jammed into the wooden frame of the door. The blade was embedded deep, its handle still slick with moisture from the snow. I slammed the door and locked it again, dragging the kitchen table in front of it for extra security. Every window and door in the house was checked and bolted. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, clutching the fire poker, waiting for the next sound. The 5th night was the worst. By then, I was barely sleeping. my nerves frayed from days of tension. I debated calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I heard whispers and found a knife? It was just past midnight when I saw it. I had been pacing the living room, trying to calm myself, when a movement caught my eye through the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but as I got closer, I saw the figure standing in the yard. It was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette barely visible against the trees. It wore what looked like a long, tattered coat that flapped slightly in the breeze. Its face was hidden, obscured by shadow or some kind of covering, but its posture was rigid, unnatural. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it through the window. The beam landed squarely on the figure, but it didn't react. It just stood there, completely still, facing the house. Desperate, I banged on the glass, yelling again, "Leave! You're not welcome here!" Nothing, no flinch, no acknowledgement. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. But eventually the fire began to die, and I lost sight of the figure in the growing darkness. When I looked again, it was gone. The sixth night was my breaking point. By then, I was running on pure adrenaline, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. I had dragged furniture in front of all the doors and windows, leaving only a narrow pathway between the couch and the fire. The poker remained by my side, my only source of comfort in the relentless isolation. I remember staring into the dwindling flames, trying to stay alert when I heard it. A noise that made my stomach drop. Footsteps. They weren't outside this time, they were inside the house. At first, I told myself it wasn't possible. Every door and window was locked and barricaded. But the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from the kitchen toward the living room. I froze, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles ached. The steps stopped just beyond the edge of the living room, where the light of the fire met the shadows. I waited, breath held, but nothing emerged. The silence was suffocating, and then came another sound, breathing. It was deep and labored, as though whatever was there struggled for every inhale. It wasn't human. It didn't have the rhythm of someone who had been walking in from the cold. The air seemed to change, thickening with a damp, earthy smell that reminded me of rotting wood and wet dirt. I backed toward the couch, my eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. And that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows. It wasn't moving, just watching. It was there, large and exceptional, like a thing of art, standing in the shadows. It was there, large and exceptional, like a lake from the future. I blinked and it was gone. I could feel my chest tightening as panic set in. I had to do something, run, fight, anything, but my body refused to move. The footsteps started again, this time circling the room. Desperate, I backed myself into the corner, barricading myself with the couch. The fire was almost out now, leaving only faint embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. My breathing was shallow, the sound of it nearly drowned out by the pounding in my ears. And then I heard it. My name. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from directly behind me. I whipped around, swinging the fire poker wildly, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, and for a split second, I thought I felt something. A faint brush of cold air against the back of my neck. I turned again, heart racing, but once more I was met with nothing but shadows. The footsteps faded after that, and the breathing stopped. The house fell silent again, but the tension didn't leave. I stayed huddled in the corner until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. It was only then, with the morning light streaming in, that I allowed myself to move. But the feeling of being watched never left. By the seventh morning, my nerves were completely shattered. Every small sound, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of something unseen. I hadn't slept in 2 days, barely 8, and I was counting down the hours until the family was supposed to return. But they came back earlier than planned. I was startled when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, followed by the sound of the car doors closing. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard familiar voices calling out. Relief washed over me as I ran to the door and saw them. Alive, normal, bringing the chaos of family life back into the house. At first, I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but as they started unpacking and settling in, I blurted it all out. I told them about the whispers, the knocking, the figure in the yard, the handprint, the footsteps inside the house. They listened politely, though I could tell they didn't believe me. "You've been out here alone for too long, the father said. "You make me wish I'd never made this mistake. You've been out here alone for too long." The mother agreed, suggesting I must have had nightmares brought on by the isolation and the eerie setting. I wanted to argue, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I was just the college kid, watching their house for a week. What reason did they have to take me seriously? That was when their dog, a large, friendly retriever, began acting strangely. He had been running around the yard, happy to be home, but as soon as he approached the back porch, he stopped abruptly. His tail lowered, and he let out a low, menacing growl I hadn't thought him capable of. "Buddy, what's wrong?" The mother called, but the dog wouldn't budge. He stood frozen, staring at the back door, growling louder. When the father tried to coax him inside, Buddy backed away, barking sharply at the house. The mood shifted. They didn't say anything, but I could see the unease creeping into their faces. The father went inside, and I followed him, hesitantly. The mood shifted. The misty air became clearer. A door clicked open, and then the door clicked shut again. The mood seemed to change. They were beginning to see. I furthered my inspection, checking the locks and windows, making sure the doors were unlocked. Jenna stood, creeping closer, the mood slowly settling on her face. But when he opened the door to the attic, he stopped. The small door had been shut tightly when I checked it earlier, locked with a sliding latch that hadn't been touched in years. Now, the wood around the latch was splintered, as if something had clawed at it. Deep, jagged marks ran across the frame, too precise to be caused by age or weather. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice low. He reached out to touch the marks, his hand hesitating before pulling back. I felt a chill run through me as I stared at the claw marks. They hadn't been there before. I would have seen them during one of my frantic checks of the house. The family was quiet after that, moving through the rest of the house without saying much. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, the mother pulled me aside. She explained, hesitantly, that there were stories about the woods surrounding the house. Local folklore, she called it. But her tone suggested she believed it more than she wanted to admit. She told me about the Watcher of the Woods, a figure whispered about for generations in the area. According to the stories, the Watcher was a presence tied to the land, neither living nor dead. It wasn't violent, but it was territorial. It was said to appear to those who stayed in the woods alone for too long, a reminder that the land didn't belong to them. I asked her why they had never mentioned it before. She shrugged, her face pale, and said they had always considered it just a ghost story. But after what they had seen, the claw marks, the dog's behavior, they were starting to wonder if it was something more. I left the next morning, shaken but grateful to get away from that house. The family stayed, though they told me later they moved out a year later after more strange occurrences. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone. Even now, years later, the memories of those nights haunt me. I've tried to move past it, to convince myself that what happened was a trick of my imagination, an overreaction to isolation and fear. But deep down, I know that's not true. The sounds, the smells, the whispers, those were real. I can't explain them, and I won't try. They've stayed with me, etched into my mind like the claw marks on that attic door. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it, that whisper. My name, spoken so softly, it barely registers, yet clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. And what haunts me most is the question I can never answer. Was it a warning? Or an invitation? Before we wrap up, I want to thank you for listening to this story. If you found it as chilling as I did living through it, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, we explore more unsettling stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Stories that make you question the boundaries between the seen and the unseen. And trust me, there's more to uncover.